This is episode 11 with Steve Hall. Welcome to the Grow Podcast with myself, David O'Connor, where my goal is to interview world-class guests so you can constantly progress as a person in terms of your training, your mindset and nutrition. So without further ado, let's dive in. How are we keeping, guys? And a big welcome back to the Grow Podcast. And today I have Steve Hall back on the show. And if you remember, Steve was here for episode 8, where we kind of went through some volume landmarks for phasing, as we call it, for hypertrophy and body composition gain. So basically like building muscle, losing body fat. And with that then we kind of touched on an insight into some fat loss phases. And I realised during that podcast, I was like, okay, right, we can probably dive into a lot more detailed stuff here. And that's exactly what we've kind of started with at least today, in terms of a general overview of a fat loss phase versus a mini cut. And kind of just the ins and outs with that. And we talk about some nutritional kind of hacks and that kind of stuff to make life easier when you're dropping body fat and getting leaner. And that's about that, really. I'm just going to stop talking and we'll welcome Steve on the show. So, Steve, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me again. Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to be back. And Steve, I suppose if anybody wants to kind of look into your background again, I'll refer them back to the first podcast, which will be in the show notes we done together. But I want to touch on what you've done since we've last spoke. Like, what have you been doing in terms of your own, we'll say, health and fitness goals?
Wow, I can't actually remember when we last... It was a while ago since we last spoke. Was I in prep? I'm not sure I was even... Had I started my contest prep?
I think you definitely were in it, yeah. But
okay.
I don't think you'd done any shows though then.
Okay, yeah. So, yeah, I've competed in the NPA and the UK DFBA, who are two natural bodybuilding federations in the UK. And I also... I've competed 4 times. I did 4 shows. 2 more shows than I was expecting because I qualified for finals, which I was extremely happy about, and ended up placing at both finals in the top 3 at the MPA. Well, I say top 3 at the MPA. I should really say 3rd because that makes me sound better than I am. 3rd at the MPA and 5th at the UK DFBA. Both of those ecstatic with, because obviously every single competitor there is of the highest caliber. So I had no expectations going into my bodybuilding prep, so to come out with 4 trophies by my side, I'm ecstatic. And so I guess since we last spoke, I lost a load of fat, got pretty diet fatigued and won some trophies, and now I've probably gained a little bit of fat back and feeling much more energetic, eating a lot more food.
Yeah, I think I remember I was actually doing like a small mini cut phase myself, because I was going away for a couple of weeks. But since I have come back, it's like we've gone the complete opposite, because I went straight into like a gaining phase / performance for the remainder of our GAA season, which only finished last week. And you did, I think, you did the 4 shows in the meantime, which is, a lot of respect is the easiest way to put that.
I appreciate that.
But Steve, today we're basically going to go into a bit more depth on kind of fat loss phases and kind of what that means versus like a mini cut phase. So basically fat loss phases. We touched on them very briefly, I think, last time, and light bulbs went off in my head realizing, okay, we can probably go into like 4 or 5 more podcasts on different style of phases and whatnot. Mm-hmm. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to do a basic like nutrition 101 recap to set the scene for this, and then I'm going to get you to chime in on anything that I can brush up in that. So this is going to be super fast. So like number 1, you need to be in a calorie deficit to drop body fat. There's no 2 ways about it. So number 1 is creating that deficit. That's in terms of the raw fundamentals with the nutritional side of things. Number 2, training. You could say for somebody who's not exactly going to do a Steve Hall 4 shows, but for somebody who just wants to lose a bit of body fat and feel a bit better about themselves, training, resistance training 3 to 5 times a week is a good guideline roughly. And that all depends on where you're starting, of course. But last time we touched on volume, Steve, in terms of body parts and how much sets to do per week. And we said the research was currently showing at least a starting point, maybe even less as a starting point, but around 10 sets per week, and increase that then from there over like a 3 to 5 week block is a nice example. So have you anything to add to those 2 super basic kind of recaps, Steve, before we go any further?
I think the only thing I'd say is when we are talking about fat loss, because people, this is just something really basic to draw out from the beginning. We're talking about fat loss and not weight loss. So we want fat to be lost, and that means we need to maintain our lean tissue. So when we're talking about that calorie deficit, we also need to provide sufficient protein. And like you said, the weight training, the reason for the weight training is to give our muscle reason to stick around. That's literally the only things I'd add to that.
Perfect. Yeah, and we're going to probably get into those details in a bit later on anyway. So, number one, I want to clarify, what do I mean, Steve, and what do you mean by a fat loss phase versus a mini cut? Are they not the same thing? And yeah, so like, what would you classify a fat loss phase as first?
Fat loss phase would literally just be getting into that calorie deficit and losing fat. And the reason it's the only difference between kind of just a general fat loss phase versus a mini cut is the length and the aggressiveness. So a mini cut, because of its shorter length, can be slightly more aggressive in terms of how much weight we lose per week and how big a calorie deficit we create. Because the longer we go dieting, the harsher our body kind of reacts to that in the simplest way. And so if we are going to aim to lose a lot of fat, then we need to do it over a more extended period of time and be less aggressive with it. Otherwise, we're probably going to see a bad reaction.
Yeah, so like, I suppose in my viewpoint as well, a mini cut, you've kind of like you have less wiggle room, we'll say, in a mini cut, because you are in a more aggressive calorie deficit. Training volume might be slightly bit higher. But the fat loss phase, I suppose, is it more sustainable long term, Steve, compared to a mini cut?
Exactly, yeah.
Cool. And yeah, this is why I wanted to bring that point up, because I see when a lot of people want to get into a fat loss phase, they always try and throw the kitchen sink at it and just, create the biggest deficit they can and do as much as they can with training and going for runs outside their training and all this kind of stuff. So I suppose just to kind of clarify a few things around that as well, I suppose we already have, really. It's not to do that when you're in a fat loss phase versus a mini cut. But when would you, I know we have to kind of bring things into context a bit more, but when would you plan with, say, a fat loss phase versus a mini cut, depending on, let's just say, I'm going to give you an example, somebody who probably wants to get to a certain level of body fat percentage, right, roughly, or weight, and we know that it'll probably take them anywhere from 8 to 12 months, okay, but they have, holidays, weddings in the meantime. What way would you plan out that, let's say, 8 to 12 months? I know it's a big thing, but it's no harm to create context around that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, it's definitely completely individual. So every single person they're going to have different preferences in terms of, like, some people respond really well to aggressive dieting and then periods off dieting, because you'd have to do that. If it's a mini cut, you can't kind of keep running your mini cut for weeks and weeks and weeks. I'd say kind of cutting that at 6 weeks is a good idea. I do like mini cuts for kind of setting up a longer fat loss phase, in that if the person is in a healthy, settled state of mind, they can deal with quite harsh restriction. You can go quite hard at the beginning because the body isn't adapting too harshly, and you're going to kind of soften up the approach as you go later. So you can get really good kind of client buy-in, or just personal buy-in. If you like seeing the scale go down rapidly, you like seeing immediate results, a mini cut's really good for that. But it's only going to be the starting point, because from there on you need to really start dialing it back and taking a slower approach. Otherwise, you are going to risk muscle loss. You're also going to risk kind of hitting a wall too soon. So you can kind of take the first lap quick in a way, like a car could go round quickly and then it needs to kind of slow down. You don't necessarily need to do that, though. You could just start off with just a general fat loss phase where maybe you're losing 1% per week, whereas when you're doing the mini cut, you might even aim up to 2% depending on the person. And yeah, that's the biggest difference. So for someone who they've got a solid year ahead of them of dieting, you might be like, right, actually, we're going to take a conservative fat loss phase, or just a generic one. We're going to diet for 6 weeks. We're going to put in a break during that 6 weeks where the person maybe has a wedding or an occasion, and we're going to take our time with it because they have no kind of timeline. They're not competing. They don't have like any events that they need to particularly be like ready for. So when they do come up, we can take them as just periods of time not dieting. We can use them to kind of recover a little bit psychologically and physiologically, and then just plan it out down that sort of line. So that would be the main thing for that person. So they need to realize that they can't lose all that fat in a short window. It needs to come off gradually, otherwise the body just won't react well to it.
Yeah, and I know sometimes when I'm giving these questions, I realize, I should be probably giving more context around an example, but these are the type of questions that we probably both get as coaches, Steve, as well, and people are very black and white with their questions, which is fine. Look, they don't understand, they may not understand kind of the context they're asking it from, but a lot of this really does depend on the person. It depends on lifestyle factors. It depends on a lot of things. It depends on if there was a fucking tragedy in the family, that's going to throw you off for weeks. You're not going to be worrying about a fucking mini cut, simple stuff. But it's nice to kind of know, right, I'm going to do this plan block and I'm going to give it the commitment that it needs, get the results, get in, get out, take my break and move on. Because I just find a lot of people, if they kind of half-arse start something, they're just quote unquote losing body fat without any kind of light at the end of the tunnel or plan break or anything like that. Even though they may be flexible, they might be allowing a bit of chocolate in here, there, whatever it is. Still, I just find a few weeks in, it just kind of fizzles out after a while. And that's more so from people kind of getting on to us and what they've done in the past. But when you plan things and set rough estimates and dates, it makes it a lot easier. So I suppose, Steve, then you touched on a bit of targets and that kind of stuff. So if we were to kind of work off that, like for a general fat loss phase, you can pick whatever length you want. Just with, I suppose, what is a sustainable rough guideline for a deficit? And I'll ask my next question after we talk about that.
So I think it's, again, like you said, like it's just so individual. There's so much context there. So one person they might have a very stable life. They might be, I don't know, they might not have any commitments in terms of kind of family, and they might not be particularly social, and they might just be like, right, I work from home and I can just do it. Like they can just keep going and they don't have a stressful environment, which stress is a huge component of this, and also kind of those psychosocial factors as well. So it's like, well, a stress is the fact that you're going to be missing out kind of drinks with friends or parties and events and meals out potentially. So it definitely depends on the person. But in general, I think kind of 15 weeks is about the longest I like to see someone go for, or like losing about 10% maybe of their total body weight. And then after that period of time, the body just really starts reacting quite badly. In that you just, for every kind of pound of fat you have to lose, you have to try so much harder than what you should have to. And so taking a break then to maintain that fat loss for a period of time is an excellent idea. But again, some people might not even be able to go that 15 weeks. They might need breaks intermittently, which you could do via kind of refeeds or just maintenance weeks or diet breaks, to keep them going. It's kind of like if I was going to put an analogy to it, like every single car should be able to do that kind of a 15-mile journey, say, well, that's a silly amount of distance, but let's say 150 miles. But some cars might break down, other cars might they might have to take a different route to get to that destination. It might take a bit longer, and they might therefore have to kind of refuel at petrol stations a bit more. There's so many different ways to get to that end result, and it's going to differ for every single person. I think as an individual, it's really important just to think about, okay, so the goal is to lose fat, so I don't want to lose muscle, so I need to make sure my training performance is good. So if you see training performance start dipping, that's a sign that something needs to potentially change. If you see kind of weight loss just really plateauing and not going where you think it should go, then that's a sign that maybe you actually need to take a break, especially if you're feeling these other factors as well, such as high hunger levels. Even if you're doing everything right, like you're eating high volume food, satiating foods, you're not eating loads of junk, you're making sure to kind of have high protein in your diet, and you're still feeling ravenously hungry all the time, no matter what you do, you're well hydrated, that's another sign that you probably should take a break. Especially for people just don't have timelines. I find it crazy how people who people hate dieting, but that's because they push it aggressively and they make it a horrible experience. Whereas I think you can make a diet, yes, you're always going to be hungry, but you can make a diet a bit more sustainable, especially if you take breaks away from dieting. It's like people want to think, oh, if I push hard for 15 weeks, then I can never have to diet ever again. Whereas actually that's probably going to end up you maybe splurging, binging, thinking dieting's horrible. But if you split that 15 weeks up into like 5-week chunks and then took like 2 weeks off in between each chunk, you might well sustain that fat loss, and the dieting was never that hard. So yeah, like you said, so much context and so much individualization, even though you can have these broad kind of rules and generalizations.
Yeah, and you said as a broad rule, you said 15 weeks around 10% body fat loss, and that obviously could be lower or higher, depends on how much somebody has to lose as well, of course.
Yeah, I mean, this is assuming it's someone who's not super lean, because if they're a male bodybuilder prepping for a show, I think that 10% is quite... I mean, if they might even be 10% body fat themselves, so...
yeah, exactly. But again, no, it's nice to give kind of rough ballparks, because then people stop thinking in their heads, oh, I have to lose 2 pounds a week. I have to lose 2.5. You know, they know that things are tailored to their individual needs, if you like. And just in terms of a deficit, I got a couple of questions around calculating deficits. And I know it's probably going away from the topic of phasing, and we're kind of going a bit deeper, but I suppose, I was going to answer it there, but Steve, methods of creating deficits, there's a few. How do you go about that with somebody?
So again, it's going to be individualized in terms of kind of their preference. But like you said, like you have to create a calorie deficit. That means either energy expenditure needs to come up or calorie intake needs to come down. There's the input and output. And probably most likely you need to have a combination of the two. Otherwise, it's just going to be very difficult. I mean, if you try and if we're going for that traditional pound of fat loss a week and you want to be in a 500 calorie deficit a day, to create a 500 calorie deficit via exercise is going to be hard work. And it's much easier, I think, to think about. I always come back to the example of like, okay, you can either chop out a slice of toast or you can kind of walk outside for 20 minutes. That's going to be like, and I don't really like comparing them like that, but you think about the amount of time lost, you think about kind of the stress that's involved during that exercise and kind of the boredom of doing it, whereas chopping out a slice of toast is much more calculable, it's much easier. So I definitely think there needs to be a combination of the two. When you are on low calories, so if you're a small sedentary female, for example, and I say female because they inherently burn fewer calories and they are smaller than us guys, and they have less muscle mass, all of those factors kind of count against them. They unfortunately sometimes have to cut their calories very low. So by giving them the option of doing some cardio so they can eat a little bit more, that is good. But for most males that I try and really get most of the fat loss via their diet and allow the weight training to sustain their muscle mass. It's just much more predictable. Because giving the example of kind of doing extra cardio versus chopping out a little bit of food, if you chop out 100 calories, you know you've chopped out 100 calories, assuming the person is tracking accurately. Whereas if you add on 100 calories of cardio, you have to think, okay, that took maybe 15 minutes. You would have burnt calories in that 15 minutes anyway. And are you going to be more lazy during the day? Are we actually going to accrue a net kind of 100 calories? Maybe not. Maybe it's only 50. And then the body gets more efficient even at doing it. And so that 50 reduces to 40 over a few weeks because the body's got more efficient at kind of doing the exercise, which is a good thing really, but not for fat loss. You want inefficiency. So I think cardio is way overstated as a method for fat loss, and I'm not really sure where it came from, but you certainly don't need it. I think still people think you need to do cardio to lose fat, and that's absolutely not the case.
Yeah, people think that as well. if you're sweating, you're doing more work than weight training, and especially this time of year in Ireland, like, and probably the UK as well, it's getting cold as well. So sweating will be less in the gym. So they're thinking then, oh shit, I'm not doing anything. You're dead right. I see that a lot. And as well, it all comes back to educating the client around what's what and what can be done. And then when they see the results, they know, and hopefully if they're consistent with it and whatnot, they'll realise that over the long term as well. But so I suppose, Steve, would I be right in saying then, like, let's just pretend that somebody hadn't a clue where to start with calorie intake. They start tracking their calories for a couple of weeks, and they're taking in, let's just say I was taking in around 3,000 calories, and I had a target set up to get to a certain level of body fat, and I suppose that target worked out to be a pound a week of fat loss. Again, just a very, very rough example. If I stayed with, say, weight training 4 times a week, and I created like a 15 to 20% reduction in calories from that 3,000, that's one way to do it. And if I was hitting that 1 pound of fat loss target a week for my fat loss phase, isn't that okay? As long as, obviously, if I have sufficient protein targets and everything else, but that's one way to do it.
Yeah, certainly. I don't see a problem with that at all. Generally, when I think there's various ways to set a deficit. You can set it via you can take a percentage off, like 15 to 20% is a pretty fine deficit for most people. Often I actually look at how much should this person be losing in terms of percentage per week, which is roughly determined by their body fat level. So the fatter they are, the higher the percentage, maybe closer to 2% if they're like 20% plus. And then if they're like 10%, maybe they want to lose half a percentage of their body weight per week. Then you work out what that number is. So maybe it is that pound. So you want a 500 calorie deficit to get the percentage of weight loss per week. But like we already explained, there's so many factors going into this. As long as you create that deficit, then you track the body weight, then you see the result, then you can be like, right, that's less than a pound. Let's go a bit more assertive. That's more than a pound, or whatever it might be. You can kind of adjust as you go along. You're going to have to adjust as you go along anyway.
Yeah. And we both know as well, there's a lot of online calculators that are going to spit out calories and macronutrient targets for you as well, because when I asked even on Instagram last night, I think there was 3 questions I got back that were asking that specific one as well, so hopefully that clarifies that. Okay, so in terms of the actual fat loss, let's just say let's just use the 15-week example again, Steve. We're during the 15-week example of a fat loss phase, and you've already touched on stuff like diet breaks and whatnot, and I actually use different terminology for refeeds, for example. I'll tell you that in a second, but what I'm going to call them fundamentals, because I do truly believe that once people understand these, especially here in Ireland and where I live, like, it's really fitting for their lifestyle to allow somebody, or not allow, but for them to realise that they can eat more on certain days of the week if they want. And once we kind of get a basic guideline of them, right, you've X amount of calories is your rough target. If you hit that across the week, you're going to be down in body fat. Everything's great. But what happens then when they go eating more on a Saturday or a Friday night or whatever? And then that's when we educate them around that and manipulate them throughout the week. So, I suppose, have you any other tools in the toolbox like that for keeping sane, we'll say, while dieting?
Yeah, so I guess you kind of touched on this in a roundabout way, in that we know when we weigh in, we have daily fluctuations on the scale, and then we take a weekly average. And it is that average which is the important thing. It isn't the day-to-day that really matters. It's long-term. So the same could be said for calories. You could be in a surplus some days, a deficit some days, maintenance some days. As long as by the end of that week, your overall net in a deficit on average, then you will be losing weight. So if you have days at which maybe you planned even to be in a deficit, but you overate by 500 calories, say, and you were planned to be in a 500 calorie deficit, then what's happened that day? You've just maybe not lost any fat. And what is that? That's 1/7 of a pound. It's really nothing. I mean, if you keep accruing those days, it kind of starts really slowing things down. But that it's not a big deal. So it's just important to say you are a flexible dieter, and that if you do kind of quote unquote screw up one day, then it's okay just to get back to your usual diet, and the next day you don't need to like binge many days and purge many days. It's just get back to the diet, get back to the drawing board. It's okay. You didn't lose that 1/7 of a pound. So that's one tool, just generally flexible dieting and having the mindset that it's not that serious. You can kind of screw up a day and it not be the worst thing. And then another tool would be kind of that weekly average. So calorie cycling is nothing special. For people who have kind of very samey energy expenditure, they probably don't need to worry about even contemplating cycling their calories. But for people who have, they want to go out on the weekend or maybe even have meals during the week, and they know this is going to happen, then they can kind of cycle their calories to have more calories on some days and less on other days. And I tend to limit this to about 20% of their calorie intake. So if they want to put 20% of their calories to one day extra, then they can take that 20% across a number of days or across one day if they want to, and kind of make up the difference. So along the week, there's kind of ups and downs, but by the end of the week, there's the average that they're aiming for. So if they're on 2,000 calories, say, they give 20% extra to one day, so that's 2,400 calories. That might just give them enough to have a nice meal out. And then they need to take off those 400 calories maybe across 4 days or across kind of 2 days, and kind of so it equals out. I limit it to 20% because I find if you do more than that, potentially the person ends up feeling like they're really kind of, they're close to that binge and purge kind of area. If you kind of move, if you were to think like 50%, you go to 3,000 calories. That's a lot for someone who was on 2,000. And then maybe they try and do 1,000 calories on a certain day, and it just gets a bit too topsy-turvy for my liking. So I'd say in addition to your kind of the refeeds and the diet breaks that we've spoken about, kind of flexible dieting as an overall concept, and then kind of having the weekly average as a goal, are two very useful tools.
Yeah, and another term I use for it, you've definitely heard of this before, is spending and saving calories. And if you think of it like a bank, you're saving one day to spend another. And yeah, you're right. We don't use the 20%, but it would never probably go above that anyway, or it might touch on above it a bit, but it wouldn't be anything like the 50% like you were kind of suggesting. You mentioned, Steve, as well, I think you mentioned it in the sentence, high volume foods as well. Yeah, I think a lot of people just they're not fully aware of what we mean by high volume foods, and all it is just to fill you fecking up. So like, I know I actually got a nice tip from you when I was going through my last mini cut, and that was your massive salad. Yeah, tell us about that, I suppose.
So every single evening, and I'm still doing this, and I probably will do for quite a while, I have a massive salad. It's not necessarily the fact that it's the evening or anything like that, but I did mention the time I have it because most people are hungriest in the evening. And that's when we're kind of normally sitting down, relaxing, and we may not be physiologically the hungriest, but psychologically we just want to pick at things. So the high volume foods come in real handy, and that's the massive salad, which is just like it sounds. It's anything and everything you want it to be in there. So I put in spinach, lettuce, tomatoes, peppers, at the moment sweet corn because I've got the extra carbs, but every single vegetable, broccoli, I just chuck it all into a salad. I kind of coat it in some salt and some salsa, and then that's kind of a huge amount of not calories, a huge amount of food that will fill the stomach. And when we fill the stomach, if it stretches the walls, that actually sends then hunger kind of fullness signals, to our brain that we've kind of satisfied ourselves. And that's a really important thing. And we also, as kind of humans, our body doesn't track calories, and quite often it just thinks about total quantities of kind of the size of things kind of coming into our body. So if you can have low calorie items that are very big, low calorie per bite is a good kind of term for them, then the body doesn't necessarily recognize that it's getting less calories. At least can happen in the short term. So this is just a strategy to really fill you up. It works well in the evening because then hopefully it stuffs you so you don't end up snacking on all these calorie dense foods. That's the massive salad. And I think it's just a good habit to get into. There's been studies done on people kind of implementing having a salad before a main meal. They eat less. And it's just because, and the salad could be 100 calories, and then they eat actually 200 calories less at the meal. So they've net 100 calories there. And these are people who don't have like a full awareness of how many calories are in items, and they're not tracking. They're just going through a study. So if we do this kind of just naturally, we can only assume that it's going to help by having these kind of higher volume foods, which, vegetables are an absolute godsend on a diet. But you can take that too far sometimes.
Yeah, and I think the game changer for me with your salads was the salsa. Jeez, I didn't.
Oh yeah.
I don't think I've ever had it really on its own like that, like with something. It's always been in like whatever salsa comes from. That I'm not going to embarrass Mexican. Yeah. I was afraid to say it. But yeah, I think otherwise a lot of people just wouldn't probably enjoy it as much. I'd eat it anyway, you know. But yeah. It's salsa, just a game changer. But one thing that popped into my head then when you were talking there was, and I actually had this conversation last week with somebody here, is the plate sizes you use. And even like I went through a phase of having porridge a lot with protein powder and some berries, and I had like a bit of dark chocolate. I went through like a literally 2-year phase. No matter if I was in a gaining phase or if I was in a fat loss phase or a mini cut phase, I still had to have it. Yeah. And for me, the only difference was, obviously the quantities was the difference, but I used a much smaller bowl when I was in a fat loss phase, and I used a teaspoon that was actually smaller than a teaspoon. But it makes the world of difference, I think, and even plate sizes, that kind of stuff, the bowl you have the salad in, you'd be surprised on the effect it has in someone's head. Like if you put that big salad, that massive salad, quote unquote, in a massive bowl, it mightn't look as massive anymore. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. It's simple psychology stuff like. But no, that's brilliant, Steve. And I think I've covered everything I wanted to cover there, and I've got some of the questions from the listeners in there too. But the next kind of section then is, what would be, if we were to put them in like guidelines, specific targets for the mini cut phase then, like how aggressive would you push that fat loss target per week? Obviously I know it's dependent on the person's body fat levels and whatnot, but generally for somebody who is 20-25% body fat for a male, what would you push per week in a mini cut if we had 6 weeks?
Yeah, so I can even go through the recommendations for each kind of body fat if you wanted. But so the upper end, I basically have a bit of a scale where you find like your calorie deficit sweet spot, I think I called it, and someone else might have come up with that as well. But for someone who is at that kind of the 20 plus range as a male, or maybe 30% plus as a female, I think 2% of their body weight per week is aggressive, but absolutely fine for that individual. And then as we scale that down, maybe they're coming to 15%, maybe they want to, or 25% for a female, maybe scale that down to 1.5% of their body weight per week on average. And then as they get leaner, so 10%, maybe you scale that down to 1% at most, or 20% for a female, 1% at most. And then under 10%, a mini cut isn't appropriate. Even at 10%, you might argue that it's not really something that someone that lean needs to go through. They can mass.
Yeah. No, that's perfect. And that's a blog, isn't it? You have written.
Yeah, I think I have. I think there's actually a blog called The Calorie Deficit Sweet Spot.
I will definitely, I'll link that up anyway. And I know now the last 2 podcasts as well, we've touched briefly on diet breaks, and I have a blog myself in that. And if you have anything on that, Steve, as well, let me know so I can link it up too.
Awesome.
And what we were talking about, the hunger and high volume foods and stuff, myself and one of the coaches, Robbie, here in the gym, we actually only done a video on that on this Monday as well, so I'll link that up.
Nice.
Okay, I had something there. Okay, it's gone out of my head for now. But I had one question that came in from a listener last week. It's really going to make you think, so I'll say it slowly. Okay.
Oh, God.
Okay, how many sausages can you eat in a week and not die?
Oh dear. Was this someone trolling me?
You know who it is, do you?
Is this David Nolan?
Yes.
Wait, I might have even asked him this. Did I make that up?
Yeah.
I can't even remember my own question.
Okay. What's the answer?
Man, I think I think David should experiment. Start off with 100. I think that's a conservative aim, and then just kind of double it every week till he dies.
Pork sausages, okay. Okay. Well, Dave, he'll be happy now I've asked that. Okay, so yeah. Steve, is there anything else we're missing out on in terms of like the ins and outs of a fat loss phase and a mini cut phase? I suppose, yeah, maybe one roundup thing for that is, do you have like some form of, I know we do anyway, we have like a checklist for what to do if you're stalled or what to do if you think you're stalled, and I think a lot of this comes back to the way they're assessing their progress. Mm-hmm. And again, keeping the bigger picture in mind and how things are not going to be exactly linear. So yeah, do you have any form of checklist for if somebody is stalled, we'll say?
I think you can give out general guidelines with this sort of thing, but it's really quite complex because you have to make so many assumptions about that individual. For example, that they're actually tracking accurately, or they're not overestimating their energy expenditure, because those are two things. If you immediately have either of those wrong, you're already like, right, what can we do? So for my clients, when they check in with me, they report their accuracy in terms of kind of how much, if they've weighed and tracked everything and it's been homemade, they can have a 5. Most people are reporting 4s because they haven't necessarily done that. They may have estimated some foods, but there's so much underreporting happens with especially just general pop people. So I think that's something you have to, like, that's almost a prerequisite before you even think about kind of, am I stalling? It's like, well, are you actually, do you know what you're doing? Do you have an accurate idea of how many calories you're having? Because you might think you're stalled on 2,000 calories, but you might be eating like 2,600 because you're not tracking various elements of your diet. You're picking at things. And then again, you have to assume that they're weighing in accurately. So it blows my mind when kind of, I even sometimes get this with clients where they'll be tracking their body weight and they're on holiday, and I'm like, why are you reporting this? And I'm like, and they're like, well, I'm still kind of checking in with you. They have a scale here at the apartment or whatever it might be. And I'm like, but that scale is completely like irrelevant to the scale that you have at home. It's measuring it in such a different way. And maybe that's not the best example, but people weigh themselves they weigh themselves at night, they weigh themselves with clothes on, they weigh themselves after eating food, drinking. They weigh themselves commonly at the gym, and that again is not good. You need to have a consistent way of weighing yourself. So those two things are like prerequisites. If you don't have those nailed, then you need to go back a little bit to the drawing board and really kind of assess things. And then you have to have a think about, often I get to kind of the generalized approach is kind of how long has it been? I think that's an important factor, because if it hasn't been that long, then normally I just say wait it out. And if the longer the person's willing to wait, the longer kind of, if you don't have a deadline, then just, it may well come, because often it does. And if you're showing all the signs of being in a calorie deficit, like you are actually hungry and you are being kind of good with your food choices, and you are making sure to get enough sleep and all of these things, you're not excessively stressed, then often it the fat loss will come. It will show itself on the scale. It's just, it isn't linear, like you said. So signs of stress, if they've got lots of things going on in their life that's not going so well, if they have if they're moving house or whatever it might be, just they aren't sleeping well and they are excessively hungry, their performance isn't good in the gym, that's all signs that kind of maybe taking a break is appropriate. And then kind of, again, if you've really set a decent deficit, you shouldn't need to kind of adjust that too often. I think people are far too quick to bring calories down further or to up cardio, and it should be kind of the last port of call. So if they are feeling pretty good, they aren't showing signs of like much hunger, and they are stalled and it's been like a week or so, then yeah, that's when you make a chop. But you have to make it so you have all of that kind of that stuff ahead. And it is a last resort rather than kind of the first thing to go, because you want to lose as many calories as you can, because there's no point pushing it harder than it needs to be.
Exactly. And why would you want to put yourself on lower calories in the first place? It's, they don't realize it until they're in that lower range, I suppose. But yeah, like even I think the last 3 people over yesterday and today. 2 of them was probably the last 2 weeks of educating them on the fact that we're not touching calories yet. Stop freaking out. And then another person was they brought down their calories without letting us know. So we were actually bumping those back up. Because I think what we're doing at the moment, is we're just showing people as well, because people don't fucking think past next week, a lot of people, and it's up to you as a coach to show them that and map that out for them. But what we're doing now is we're working right up until the week before Christmas, or if they want, like the Friday before Christmas, and they have a 4, whatever, depending on whenever they kind of got refocused on it. They have like a 4 to 6 week focus block there. And I'm talking now, not somebody who's in their 20s that has no commitments and they can do it with the click of a finger. I'm talking parents that are going to be flat out to the mat with Christmas presents and everything else. Like, they have a 4 to 6 week block to get focused, to lose a bit of body fat, to have a 7 to 14 day break over that Christmas period, still get their training in to an extent, and relax the calories a bit, but still have some form of control if they can, and then they will come back in a more positive light in the new year to kind of recontinue maybe that prolonged fat loss phase, depending on where they're at. And I suppose that was one thing, Steve, to touch on, like after a mini cut, after a fat loss phase. Again, it's all individualized on where you go from there. Are you lean enough to start adding weight if you want to do that, adding mass? And that goes for ladies as well, because I think it's fine for the lads, they know that, and I think that's nearly every fucking lad's long-term goal that I get onto anyway. They want to get leaner, they want to get bigger. It's rare I see someone who doesn't want to get bigger when they're at a level of leanness. But that's probably that, isn't it? Like, it all depends on where you want to go from there and where you're at and what your next step is.
Yeah, I think the trouble is, a lot of the time when people, like we said, that 15 weeks, if they're coming to the end of that, they're almost, the number of calories they were dieting on is now their kind of new maintenance, as it were. And this isn't their fixed maintenance, it's just their body's now adapted to that. And it just gets efficient. And so we need to introduce calories back in, even if they just want to maintain. They don't want to a lot of females kind of at the end of the diet, it's just, they either go back to the way they used to eat, or they kind of are trying to maintain that what they are maintaining on, but they actually need to reintroduce some calories to get to where they should really be maintaining, so they feel healthy. And that might mean, even if they are looking to maintain that fat loss, a little bit of weight gain, because they'll be kind of storing some more glycogen and things like this. But I think it's important not to just think that at the end of the diet, that is it. Like, you just have to keep dieting on those small calories. No, that's when your body has got super efficient. It's kind of brought down your energy levels massively. You can start reintroducing a bit of food and you can still maintain. And if you do want to gain muscle, then put in more. But don't either try and maintain that diet or go back to the way you ate immediately before, because not the result you want.
Yeah, it's an eye-opener when people come to the end of a fat loss phase. They don't they're afraid to eat more. Or, like you said, you have the people then that may go off the deep end and go, quote-unquote, back to the way they used to be. And there's a lot to be said for that too, because obviously, I remember years ago when I first started giving, we'll say, nutritional advice, I was just way too strict with people, and I couldn't fathom why, a few weeks later they just go back to square one, and not realizing that was entirely my fault in terms of the coaching I was giving out and what I was kind of preaching to people. And now we've completely flipped that in its head, and yes, we have our fundamentals and our principles and all the hacks, if you like, but everything comes back to forming healthy habits and routine that you can realistically sustainably manage around your life and your family and everything else. So it's giving people the tools to get there, no more like what we're talking about in this podcast, but things have to be introduced slowly in terms of habits and whatnot. And I think that's the key at the end of the day too, isn't it?
No, exactly. And it is about, it's not sexy, it's not amazing to sell to people, but it is clever. It is, if once you understand kind of energy balance and you understand kind of the fact that the body does adapt and it does get efficient, and that fat loss and being in a calorie deficit and trying to lose fat shouldn't be the goal year round. It should be something that is periodized in, that you do kind of have times where you aim for that, and then you have times where you actually allow yourself to eat more and enjoy life. I think there's a lot of perpetual dieters out there, and it just makes me quite sad. Because they do end up doing the binge, the purge. They don't understand why dieting doesn't work for them. And it's because they don't understand the fundamental basics, which aren't, again, cool, sexy, or right, but they are clever.
Yeah, and it is, because they never, like, some people go through years of that yo-yo phase, if you like, but they never realise how enjoyable things can be if you will say, I don't want to say do it right, but if they did it better, do you know, if they were aware of these kind of basic stuff and enjoyed times like Christmas and holidays where they can bring their food up and not worry about scale weight fluctuating up a bit and whatnot, because who gives a fuck if the scale goes up a pound or two? Like, it's not, you're not competing in a sport where it's down to your weight, you know, and 99% of people we coach are people that just want to look better naked and feel better about themselves. So yeah, it's just some excellent stuff in there, Steve. And I know we probably could have went super deep and super specific, like tactics and that kind of stuff, but we may save it for again. Yeah, Steve, if you had to round that up with, like all your show notes, all your social links, everything like that, like I've done before in the last podcast, I'll share all those in the show notes anyway. But if you've anything you want to add now and round it up, now's the time.
I guess, it's just I think people need to be really honest with themselves in terms of what can they realistically sustain in terms of a deficit. And then when they are dieting, to be really honest with themselves to how hard it is. Because I think in many regards, everyone wants to be lean now. They wanted it yesterday. So they all want to go on the biggest calorie deficit, but be honest with yourself. What can you realistically sustain? And then when you are dieting and you are trying to think, okay, maybe do I need that diet break or do I need to reduce calories further? Again, be honest with yourself. How hungry are you really feeling? How lethargic are you really feeling? Are you doing everything in your power to actually make sure that you're not really hungry and really food focused? Because a lot of people they might be tempted. There'll be those people that will never want to take the diet break. They never want to give themselves a break. They just want to be lean tomorrow or lean today. And then there'd be the people that are like, oh, I'm so hungry, I'm so ravenous and starving, but they're eating protein bars and drinking fruit juice. And it's like, well, cut that out and start eating properly and making sure you're getting enough sleep and hydration. So yeah, I think a lot of honesty is needed. And sometimes a coach is required to give someone that perspective because people get very kind of trapped in their own thoughts.
Yeah, I was going to say that earlier as well. Again, when you realise it and when you hear you talking, you realise, you probably do need that number one, direction and accountability then on top of it all. Steve, absolutely excellent. There's a crazy amount of value there for people. And thank you, buddy, and we shall chat to you soon.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. And if anyone wants to kind of reach out to me, please do. And I hope this did provide some value.
Excellent. Chat to you soon. So guys, as Steve said in that last little part there, hopefully that you actually have taken value from it, because I know the value that's put across in these podcasts, but again, at the end of the day, it's up to you to kind of decipher that information and take away the key points that are applicable to you, because you know yourself, you can kind of listen to these things and kind of in one ear and out the other, but again, if you take actually, even if it's one small little thing and apply it, you'll just get a lot more from these podcasts as well. And that goes for any piece of content you consume as well at the end of the day. But as I said, any links we've mentioned, any resources and like that will be all in the show notes at docfitnessonline/episode 11. And until next time, we'll chat to you soon. Thank you very much for tuning in. Bye bye.